Hello, my name is Chris Kahns. I'm from the history department, a doctoral student. I study Southern Africa. Thank you very much for the presentations. Enjoyed them. So in these discussions of these large-scale economic growth paradigms, the emphasis seems to be, with few exceptions, apart from the education initiatives and job training mentioned with respect to India, the emphasis still seems to be on enabling capital and investment to move wherever it is most needed, wherever there are labor markets, wherever there's mines to be quarried, forests to be cut, software to be developed, what have you. So I guess I'm wondering, I find it a little bit troubling that the sort of very material base that is the environment that allows these initiatives to take place wasn't mentioned much. So my question is this, is what is your research turning up in terms of prospects for a long-term growth with respect to the environment? And I realize it's a broad question, but there's also a certain social dimension to it, not only the materials that are required for this sort of growth paradigm, but also the social implications for the people that live on and around all of this material base that is the environment. Thank you.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Are you talking about the environment as environment or the social environment?
I'm talking about, in all of the talks, one of the threads that I sort of picked up was enabling larger amounts of capital to shift around to, not a lot of specifics were mentioned, but whether it's to build bridges or to open new factories or to attract labor markets to a certain area. All of these rest on the very sustenance that allows them to happen, whether it's fossil fuels or water or what have you.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what, in terms of long-term growth, is any of your research turning up about these things? What are the sort of social and economic costs in the future with these things?
Well, I think China really creates a paradox on these choices. The government actually recognized the cost of environment and the growth of environment for quite a long time, and they also made lots of efforts like using different kinds of energy, and also improving the power of these environmental professionals. Social consciousness of this. I think there are a couple restraints in their efforts. The biggest one is that the current government, they got so much legitimacy on growth. So either it's GDP or the materialistic indicators of rising household income or the buildings. So they got tremendous legitimacy based on that. So having them to shift to a different kinds of development, that's very hard. It's like they had to shoot on their own. They had to be prepared that their own power base might be weakened. And the second part, again related to the polity, is the power of society is weak. So if there are NGOs or social groups that advocate for environment, then they would be under constant restriction, because it's very worried that this could get out of hand to become more political events. But the third actually offers more possibility of change. That is, nowadays environment-related protests or mass incidents constitute the rising share of total mass incidents in China. So currently, the peasants, we know about peasants' incidents, protests, or sometimes turning violent protests in China. The number is rising rapidly. Actually, if not half, then it's like the very approaching to the half of those incidents are related to environment. So that has put some push on the government agenda because they really want to maintain social stability. But if they continue the growth model, which they draw legitimacy, but this cannot be continued because the cost of those is creating its demise. So we'll see more concerted efforts. Maybe I'll just conclude. They are struggling between two goals. It's maintaining stability and while still continuing their legitimacy based on growth. So we don't know, but at least they show the government has stepped up efforts on addressing the environmental issues.
May I say a few
Yeah,
things
sure.
on Brazil? So I think many Brazilians would argue that the government is very concerned with inclusive growth, and the basis of legitimacy there, which comes from an alliance between, states, social movements, labor, is so heterogeneous that you can simply not have the Chinese strategy or even I would argue, the Indian one, because the basis of legitimacy of the political powers that be is very different, and that is translated into very different policies. Now. It's a very broad discussion if we were to talk about issue of redistribution. I argue that a real effort has been made there with significant results below what it could have been achieved because the socio-economic dossier there remains dire, but much better than in the 1990s. With regard to the environment per se, as in nature, okay, and living conditions in cities and so on. Four other issues that I'd like to mention. The first is that for the first time, the state has actually assumed the responsibility for living conditions for the lower income brackets. So some of the biggest developments in sanitation and housing have taken place over the last 5 to 6 years, and to a scale that has never been touched on before. The second is the pollution, and that's one of the structural bottlenecks. If we are to expand a little bit beyond that. And this is very difficult because one of the pillars of the government's industrial employment strategy is to support the car manufacturing sector, and that's like a humongous sector in Brazil. It's one of the engines of counter-cyclical spending, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this has gotten much worse since Lula, basically. Congestion rates, pollution levels in large cities. The Rousseff government has had a paper last year that seems to be a game changer, and they're putting money into this for the first time, in the sense that they are spending, they earmarked very large amounts of money for rail for the first time. They're building this high-speed train between Sao Paulo and Rio. It costs a lot of money, and they're going to expand it up north as well. So there's an international auction that has been taking place. It costs a lot of money. The government. International investors didn't want to put the money into digging the tunnels. It's a very mountainous area. The government has gone in and accepted the costs. The initial auction failed precisely because of this. International investors just wanted to build the rail, put the trains on the rail, and operate them. Didn't want to build the infrastructure itself. The government is paying for it. So there is a little bit of a tension there because all of this equipment will be imported, right? And the whole point of neo-developmentalism is to establish a strong domestic manufacturing base. And, cleaner transport means it is done with foreign products, usually, and capital. So there's a bit of a tension to be addressed there. The third aspect is the rainforest. It's a disaster there. And it's a very complicated story and not necessarily the most comforting one, in the sense that some of the members of the coalition that made Lula possible, right? Many of the landless are part of the deforestation process because, they need land and so on. And so it's very hard for the government to simply repress them. They have very large investments in road building to the rainforest that they want to carry through. So there's a lot of contentious politics surrounding that. And finally, the issue of energy, right? Brazil's biggest economic actor is a state-owned oil company, right? And they have crazy plans of digging in the pre-salt layers, and that's one of the sources of wealth in Brazil. They are diverting the money into a sovereign wealth fund, so everything sounds great. They had this very experimental biofuel program that has been the most successful in the world, basically. But now we're seeing the side negative effects of that occurring in terms of the quality of the environment as well. So these are the things. I mean, they do have the plans. It's, you know, the problem of enforcement is relatively weak. Regional governments have very weak institutional capacity. So observing environmental regulations, not so great. A lot of international consulting has gone into this, so the regulations are progressive. But there are these tensions between the new developmentalist project aimed at better quality of life as in income and employment for as many people as possible, and the environmental agenda. And, you know, I'm not in the business of prediction to tell you what is going to happen, but the social coalitions that surround these debates will probably decide what's going to happen.
Thanks. That's a very interesting question, because even in India, some people who've been, you know, critical of the growth process have emphasized that this rapid economic growth hasn't, you know, been thought of adequately as far as the long-term environmental implications go. I mean, particularly in the last 7 or 8 years, you had several projects involving the use of, you know, forest land, mining, etc., which were just cleared without a proper inspection first. In fact, our recent environment minister, who had a more competent record and who was more scrupulous than a lot of our previous ministers, had jocularly remarked that the people who carry out these initial inspections are the people who are ultimately going to, you know, be using these resources. So it would be in their interest to give an all-clear report. And particularly in the context of developing countries like Brazil, India, and China, environmental protection isn't really a luxury, because, you know, a lot of people depend for their livelihoods and sustenance on these resources. So when talking about growth policies and, you know, what looks good and so forth, you also need to take into account these broader environmental implications, both from the point of view of long-term sustainability and from the point of view of the effect that, you know, such projects can have on local livelihoods. And particularly given the recent corruption scandals that have come to light regarding the allotment of these environmental resources, you have had the Forest Regulation Act being recently passed in Indian Parliament, which seeks to regulate the allocation of these resources more closely. So I do hope that efforts like these would, you know, help to institute more checks and balances to ensure that the growth process also takes into account the longer term environmental implications.